Clearly, Ukrainians know better. It is understood that Ukraine's dependence on shipments of weapons and financial support of the West makes Zelensky and his team be more diplomatic. I don't know all the details and agreements they made, because on the second day of the summit they still had negotiations about new types of weapons. Maybe something remained kind of backstage, but political outcomes are negative. Military outcomes are satisfactory. There was some step made forward, actually little step. Political decision about Ukraine's victory is not made in the United States. We just need to take it as a reality. In the US they have a panic fear that Russia may fall apart, and they suppose it might happen if Russian army is destroyed in Ukraine and Putin's regime is dethroned. So this fear paralyzes their political will, if there is any. Potential proliferation of nuclear weapons, China getting stronger, and other potential things that Americans are trying to avoid. They're still trying to make an agreement that could soften these consequences. I can't imagine a situation in which Zelensky would give in to this pressure and make some territorial concessions. Putin's being in power makes any negotiations impossible, and if Putin leaves, then this power vertical that Americans think is a guarantee of stability in Russia will be destroyed. Today we had information about negotiations between William Burns, head of CIA, and Sergei Naryshkin, head of Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. This tells us that despite all these announcements that they're not going to do anything without Ukraine, they still have this negotiations venue with the Russians. But in fact, there is a lot of disappointments with what happened, and some Eastern European countries actually expected more from this summit. Biden's administration, let's put it this way, it's not Reagan's administration. All the attempts of this administration to seem to be what they're not disappear in the face of the reality of the war. But we don't have any other administration. So after this cold shower on July 11th, Zelensky started thinking how to move forward. After all, the war is continuing, Americans' support is coming. The only issue of fighter jets shipments, there is a feeling that it'll happen not earlier than the beginning of next year. At least based on the answers of the Minister of Defense that we got today, we can suppose that the fighter jet issue is not settled at all. And they started training, and it's going to take 6-8 months, and when those planes will be delivered, and it's a big question. Which means that Ukraine won't have a necessary advantage, not even that, support from the air for this decisive offensive in the fall. If we look at the schedule of weapon shipments and general temperature of geopolitical and military discussion, then we can suppose that Americans are not planning the end of the war earlier than summer or spring or summer of the next year. Of course, the answer is no. They very well understand it in Eastern Europe, in Baltic countries, Romanians, Poles. They understand it. All those who lived through Soviet occupation, and many reasonable people in the UK say the same. Do Americans understand that? Hard to say, but they act as if they don't understand that. They still have a feeling that there is something to negotiate about with Russia, and that's the reality that we live in, and we can't avoid it. Of course, Putin is fighting with collective West, of course with NATO, and they keep talking about it on the Russian TV, and for those who don't understand it, they could get it from the Russian TV. The Western point of view that Americans keep pushing This position ignores this reality. An attempt to get back to this old argument that any sharp actions towards Ukraine will entail direct confrontation of NATO with Russia. Everybody comes to politics from somewhere, having some experience. There is no such a profession as politician. People come to politics having a certain background. I don't know what ingredients and background made Zelensky who he is today. This indisputable leader of the free world, and maybe this is what Biden is jealous of. Somewhere deep inside he understands that this bar is way too high for him. But fact is a fact. When there was a critical hardship in February of 2022, Zelensky expressed the best qualities of human character, and he risked everything, including his own life and life of his family, and he made a decision to fight till the end. And then he demonstrated an incredible ability, and maybe his acting career helped him with that, but it wouldn't be enough anyway. The role he's playing, if we can call it a role, that requires sincerity. You can't earn people's trust all over the world with just this energy. If people feel any false note, so to speak, it means that people feel that this is real. His feelings are real, and such a unity of political leadership and heroism of people who are around him and citizens of Ukraine and soldiers, they made Ukraine the bridgehead of the free world. Therefore, I'm very negative towards some of the statements of Western politicians that Zelensky is way too harsh, and that Ukraine should be very grateful for what the West is doing. What do you mean, grateful? Ukraine is paying with blood of its people for protecting borders of the free Europe, and this is what the West was supposed to do, and NATO was supposed to do that, and was made for, and it turned out to be not ready for it. And listen what the Minister of Defense of the UK said. He said that the UK is not Amazon daily that delivers groceries. I think this is a scandalous statement, and I hope that British media will do something about it and will shake him up properly for that. This statement is absolutely inappropriate when Ukraine has such gigantic losses for actually disgraceful policy of the West. And actually it includes the Budapest Memorandum that the UK Prime Minister signed too. The guarantees of security that Ukraine got actually meant nothing. It should be properly stated that Ukraine is a member of NATO, and it will be properly formalized after Ukraine's victory. Ukraine wins the victory and becomes a member of NATO. Without all these talks and stuff, it's funny to say, Ukraine, corruption is everywhere. If Zelensky was corrupted, Trump actually offered it to him, so Biden would be in the White House right now if Zelensky didn't follow the principles. Ingratitude of Western politicians is astonishing. But I think there will be a victory. I think this historical fight of good and evil will end with the defeat of Putin's fascism. But for any delay, for any indecisiveness, for any wiggling of Western politicians, Ukraine pays with lives of its people. The answer is, of course, they're not ready because they don't know what to do, because there should be people of special caliber, people who can look forward, those who can change the paradigm of the world policy, and clearly these politicians are not ready for that. They're used to it since the Cold War, when the big countries were making decisions for others. Now the United States with China and Russia, that should be in this game too, but should be neutral in this story. But I don't even want to comment on this. The thing is that these people who are making decisions in the United States, they have a credit history. They were wrong across the board. If you look at the decisions that they made and what consequences those decisions had, in normal business, people for this are kicked out from their jobs and couldn't be hired anymore. But sadly, they're making the decisions, and the administration we have, that's the only thing that we have. Trump would have been worse. But it's not an argument anymore. There is a threat that Trump will come back, but their behavior today makes way too many questions and we don't have answers for, and I hope in the near future in the Congress, Republicans, they'll have hearings to figure out what William Burns is talking with the war criminal Narishkin. In fact, to properly put it into Russian, it is structure of civil society. But those who took this phrase out of context and started making a great fuss about it, they forgot that my position was quite consistent. Yesterday's 10-11 minutes I had, it was translation from English into Russian. My statements were the part of the articles and my talks that they made a lot since February 2022. Talking about the number of Russians that support the war and those who are against the war, I'm still sure about the numbers that I spoke at the beginning of the full-scale invasion in March, and I have been consistent with this. It seemed to me that in Russia there is no more than 10-15% of people that are against the war based on moral values. Not just in general they're against the war. They know the war is bad, you can't attack people, you can't take away people's property, you can't kill people. So the people who understand that, and actually that coincides with so-called Crimea consensus, those who are against Crimea annexation. And there's indirect confirmation of these numbers. The people who were rallying against the war in the first days of the war. Approximately there were 200,000 people, mainly in big cities. 16,000 were arrested. If you look at 200,000, this is about 1% from 10-15%. 15-20 million people who are against that, and it's the top. 1%, this is the coefficient of courage. And I don't think that people would argue, challenge these numbers. I said before, and I'm sure now, the percentage of those who support the war is not 85%. Kasparov said 10-15 against the war and then 85 for war. No, let's split this into two uneven groups. I think that percentage of the Z community, those who support the war, it was 30-35%. So the majority was kind of neutral to the war. So the war is going on, it doesn't really concern us. I don't support it, would be better if it wasn't there. So that's why this 10-15% and 30-35% who are pro-war, 10-15 against the war, and the rest is neutral. I think this is the approximate estimation of how the society is split. Some people may give different estimations. Some people say that the overwhelming majority is pro-war. And in my yesterday's remarks, I added that continuation of the war changes these numbers towards the category of these neutral people, those 60-65% of people. Not that they support the war, but they don't take it as an inevitable evil. They kind of say, well, that's our reality, so we are in the war, so we shouldn't give in. So Kramatorsk and other cities that were destroyed. If you look at the trends of Russian social media, you will see the percentage of the people that take the war as given is growing. There is no any other indicator that would show that the attitude to the war changed on a moral basis. There are some people who are trying to imagine that in Russia there are people, there is this opposition, they're against the war, but that has to do with the deterioration of the level of life of people. So there are no big shifts there. all attempts of Navalny supporters to demonstrate that in Russia the anti-war movement is growing, actually they're not proven with statistics. People kind of look at the war that is there, and the number of people that are against war is insignificant, but we're not getting to the boiling point yet. While the war is going and going relatively successful according to the Russian TV, and people watch the Russian TV, so far the war can be going. That's why I think the further continuation of the war will be worse than the situation in Russia. Is there civil society in Russia? No, it cannot be by definition, because it's a fascist state. The question itself, the wording of the question is wrong, but when an American journalist is saying, say, civil society, there are nuances in the translation. But when this subject is blown out of proportion by the people who know Russian reality very well, and they pretend that the answer I gave was as Russia as a whole, but the answer was actually in the context of what happened on 24th of February of 2022. It is cheap. It is like stacking the deck, or even distorting what was said. There are people, citizens in Russia, millions of them. Moreover, some of these citizens, they act decently and even heroically, but it doesn't make them a civil society, because civil society, these are structures, institutions that are created and function independently from what the government thinks about it. Besides, the active civil society goes against this state. In Ukraine, there is quite an aggressive civil society, and it's like vibrating civil society, very dynamic. In Russia, it simply doesn't exist. There were some rudiments of it in 1990s. The beginning of the civil society started appearing in the middle of 1980s, when Gorbachev was in power, and then in 90s it was more, and then by the 2000s it was deflating, and then by the time when there was the full invasion of Ukraine, then it disappeared, because this fascist, aggressive dictatorship that is waging a war, it cannot allow such civil society functioning of any social institutions that are not part of the orbit of the state. So civil society doesn't exist, and it's a tragedy. The country is going through a gigantic catastrophe that, with quite a high probability, entail disintegration of Russia. So I hope that some of the territories of Russia, they'll remain, and there will be some algorithm of interaction between them. But besides territorial issues, there will be moral and ethical problems and political problems. This new reality, this is a political one, and a moral issue will be that all Russian citizens will be associated with the genocide and this horrible war. And this is the issue that has such a huge reaction on the internet, this collective responsibility. There is the responsibility and the guilt. Obviously, those who were participating in the military actions, they are criminals and participants of this war. Those who follow the criminal orders and bring destruction. But there is also a number of Russian citizens that are kind of working on the war. They are producing for the war, which means somebody is supporting all this. In Nuremberg's trial, in the prisoner's dock, they had people who were from finances and some industrial projects. Not only those who were ordering to kill people and were involved in the military actions. Those who are supporting Putin's economy today, they also war criminals. Besides, we shouldn't forget about the people who are making missiles and rockets. They say they're brainwashed. I have a great suspicion that those who are making those rockets and missiles, and they're helping to bootleg electronic chips, they know how to use VPN. They know very well what's going on, and I think we can see the results of their work in Lvov and Kramatorsk and other destroyed cities. And again, this hysteria that's blown out of proportion in the internet by our liberal supporters, those who for many years insisted that Putin's regime will never get involved in such a reckless enterprise. But again, this hysteria denies an obvious fact. All of us, me included, we are responsible for this monster running Russia. It didn't appear from nothing. Putin's regime, fascism, it was growing, it was getting stronger. It's not the first war. It started with first Chechen war, and let alone the explosions of the buildings in Moscow. And all of that was happening against the backdrop that we were not ready. We were not ready to stop it. We're not going to go into details, but what happens now, it waged the biggest war in Europe since World War II, and to pretend that we have nothing to do with it. I was fighting against this, and many others did too, and for many years. But again, not going into details who was saying what since the annexation of Crimea. And some people are saying that I was in opposition. For some reason, this Crimea consensus, if they were not supporting it, but they were not very much concerned about it. Moreover, what we think about ourselves is one thing, but what's important, what others think about us. An attitude to us will be the same as it was to Germans after the war. German crimes back then, they were not so visually proven, but now it's different. And we shouldn't forget that in a decent society we will be castaways. People will talk to us at a distance as if we're leprotic. That's what it's going to be, and now we need to think about it. And right now, with what I do and my colleagues do, we are trying to lower the degree of this hatred. Because those who are shouting about this shark, this toy shark, they don't understand that they induce even more hatred. Of course, it's bad taste, this whole shark thing, but we need to shut up and not to talk about it, because nothing can compensate the fact that every day children are killed in Ukraine. And this acute reaction on this toy shark, and those people, they didn't even spend 1/100th of their energy to remember all the victims of Kramatorsk and many others. This actually aggravates the situation. That's why we have such a ferocious reply of Ukrainians, and even in Western media. So it hits us, and let those shouters shout whatever, or specialize being Russian patriots. But the fact is that they cast shadow on us too, and people perceive us through this, and we need to think about it now and do our best to change this. And Free Russia Forum is the organization that was consistent in its fight against the war, and we're trying to mitigate this hit on the reputation of Russia, and the consequences of this we'll feel for many years. We are negotiating with Estonian officials because it's very important to get their blessing to organize this event. We want to interact with governments of different countries, because the conference is a Russian-speaking conference, and again, going back to the same subject, there is some specificity in this. But in Estonia, they understand how important it is. There are big diasporas in Tallinn and other European cities, in Berlin and Prague. We actually had the conference in Warsaw too. It's very important to create an alternative and demonstrate that there is a third position. Right now there is a so-called pro-war position, then there is a TV rain community position, kind of neutral one. They're trying to be above the fight, which actually grates on Poles and Baltic countries. They have even tougher reaction on this because they think it's an immoral position. It's like people understand everything, yet they're not ready to condemn the crimes. And there is a position that we promote. This is unconditional support of Ukraine, and it is clearly stated by the Russian Action Committee. Victory for Ukraine, freedom for Russia. And promoting this narrative, this is our historical mission. We're working on holding this conference in Tallinn, and I hope they will manage to agree with Estonian authorities so that this conference will be in close cooperation with them.